Hi, I am Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Welcome to my YouTube channel and to this series called Healing Love, where we're diving into now issues around how childhood can show up in our adult relationships, really the heart of attachment, but I'm always bringing in sort of the backdrop of how complex trauma and often complicated childhoods can also impact these relationships. So, welcome back. If you're someone who joins me often, I truly appreciate you so much. And if you're new here, I appreciate you too. And I hope you'll consider subscribing and joining this little growing community. It's really just been such a labor of love for me to learn how to do this at my age and plow through it, and frankly, even have the confidence. And for years, I haven't been on Facebook for this entire time. I just had a hard time protecting my privacy, and for some reason something shifted the last few years, and I finally felt like, okay, I'm ready to share all these things that I truly am so obsessed and passionate about in terms of my job and the work I am so blessed to do. And so I am just grateful to share it with you. One more quick thing, if you're new here, please check out the links below on the courses I offer around being raised by borderline or narcissistic parents and or having a need to remother and heal yourself. Every course comes with a workbook, a PDF file of a workbook, a huge workbook in many cases, tons of videos, meditations, affirmations, journal work, exercises, you name it. And so please check those out. Okay. So today's video is really about the idea of vulnerability within intimacy and relationships. And we're going to use the template of what people who have a more anxious style of attachment tend to do when they feel vulnerable. And then I'm going to talk about, though, how that is received often by the other styles like avoidant and disorganized. Now, for today's video, we're going to really stick to just thinking about anxious and avoidant. But keep in mind, though it's a bit more complicated, at the core, we can often see a mix of anxious and avoidant behaviors, because at the heart of disorganized, that's what I'm saying, for example, we can see a mix in disorganized, is that in that style, the child often didn't know what worked. It was sort of, good and bad and easy to read and not easy to read, just sort of chaotic. And on the high end, that can manifest in a person having very dissociative behaviors, really complex traumatic responses. And on the lower end, as I've described, I think many of us who have more borderline type parents who had, especially if they weren't always difficult, they could be great. It's just that when they were hurtful and conditional or whatever, it was very, very painful or wounding, actually, I would say. We can see a lot of conditionality, especially in more narcissistic parents. But the truth is that though we describe all this stuff in all these videos, most people are not bad all of the time, right? And so the dilemma for a child with a disorganized style of attachment is that the source of safety, meaning the caregiver, was also the source of fear. And so that is a whole impossible dilemma we're going to talk more about in the rest of the series. But for today, I want you to think, if you are more disorganized, I think the best way for you to listen to this is to think about how you might do both things, avoidant and anxious, if that makes sense, okay? So just to give you a quick reminder too, in terms of vulnerability and intimacy, a person with a more secure attachment pattern is generally going to have less tolerance for these extreme behaviors. They're going to recognize earlier. They're going to feel things in their body and the relationship sooner. And though we can often get stuck too with partners who end up being not the great fit if we're more secure, generally a person with more secure attachment is going to not be terrified or afraid of or cling on to any kind of vulnerability or intimacy. They're going to have a general sense of the flow, the ebb and flow, and the reciprocity of vulnerability within a more secure relationship. So what we're going to talk about now is how vulnerability shows up in the activating strategies that we talk about for people who have a more anxious attachment system. Now remember, activating strategies are really any thoughts, behaviors, or feelings that we can kind of start to develop in ourselves to find ways to connect to this partner that we feel somehow might be threatening to leave us, or they might reject us, or we feel like we don't know what's happening in the relationship. And so what we're trying to do is find ways to do that. And then after that, these activating behaviors where we're like thinking about them excessively, like, oh, if I think about them enough, that will send the energy and they'll then think of me and then they'll text me, or we'll minimize behaviors that aren't that bad just to stay close to them. The flip side of that is the actual protest behaviors we can engage in. And I always think of protest as like, it's kind of like this, right? It's like, you're not giving me what I need and want, and so I'm going to do or say something to try to get you to respond. And the goal when we have a more anxious style is to get the person to sort of help us calm down, right? To soothe that anxiety, because we're going to do something that's going to ideally trigger something in you that will then ideally, right, push you to help us say, oh yeah, you do love us. Oh yeah, you're not mad at me. Oh yes, you do still want to date me, or you do still care about me, or you didn't forget about me. So what I want to talk about is how that often gets received, for example, in a more avoidant response or some combination. Don't forget, we all have these general main styles, but we can lean into other styles because none of us are going to fit in a box, and also because certain partners will trigger certain responses. So let's say if I'm secure, but I can have tendencies towards avoidance, and you're avoidant, whoever is the most avoidant, the other person will often become more anxious, right? Because it becomes so avoidant that all of a sudden one of us feels the need to reconnect and to kind of cling. So just keep that in mind, the flowing nature of leaning into styles with your main style, I believe, is the way to approach it. So one of the first things we can see is excessive attempts to establish contact. What does that mean? That means for an anxious person, all of a sudden, we can't get a hold of you, you're not responding to us, and so we're going to do all these things like send text messages, send emails, try to just like excessively reach out to you. And for a more avoidant person or who has those tendencies, it's going to often do the opposite, right? It's going to feel suffocating to them, and it's going to reinforce the narrative that they already have. Remember, avoidant people have a more attachment pattern where they had to shut down and deactivate their own needs because they weren't going to get met by the primary caregivers, especially around negative emotions like crying and clinginess and anger. So they're going to feel like, yeah, this just reinforces what I already believe, that people want to like suck the life out of me and they want too much from me. And so what will they do? They'll often withdraw even further, as they did in childhood, to self-protect. So that doesn't go well. So we're going to talk later about this sort of roller coaster of anxious and avoidant, and these will give you some examples, but I'll go into that more in another video. The second thing is withdrawing. Oftentimes when we're anxious, we can just withdraw. I'm just like I'm not gonna speak to you, I'm gonna ignore you, and then maybe you'll realize how much you miss me. Well, I've got news for you. If you're a more anxious person, or your partner is, I should say, sometimes they will feel relieved by that. Oh God, thank God, like they're not texting me. I can, have some time alone, or I feel kind of stressed out. And so once again, they might feel relieved. And so your little plan, I mean this lovingly because I have anxious tendencies as well, but our plan to kind of get them to respond actually backfires, right? They're thinking, the avoidant person is like, oh, thank God, right? I'm going to get a break from this. So it doesn't always work very well. The next one is keeping score. So anxious people will do this to not feel so vulnerable. And so they're keeping score, like I'm only going to call when you call. And it gives them a little bit of reassurance and power to minimize their own vulnerability. And in a sense, to be honest, sometimes it's to punish the person. Like, I'm going to make you feel what I feel because you're very tit for tat in reaching out. Or it's to trigger them, to get them to respond, right? You'll realize that there's this thing going on and you won't like it. And so you'll reach out to me. Well, the other thing it does for more avoidant people is that they see it as further proof that love is conditional, that relationships and love do have rules. And then they tell themselves, well, these are the rules. This is how you set it up. So I only have to respond when you've responded. So then they pull back even further, or they just stay in the pattern. It often doesn't trigger them to change. The next one is acting hostile. And so this is eye rolling, looking away, sighing when a person's talking. It could even reach more aggressive levels. And you can imagine for an avoidant person, for example, that is very triggering to their own vulnerability, because many of them did not engage in conflict. They avoided conflict. The parents didn't do anger or negative emotions. And so they are really unsettled by your intensity. And so they will basically become really uncomfortable and not know how to navigate that. And then that will teach them that it's safer actually to not engage with you. And so it doesn't draw them in, right? It makes them think you're even more dangerous, which is going to make them withdraw and retreat further. Threatening to leave, oftentimes those with anxious styles, we think if we just let you know that we are not going to be here and we're going to leave you, that will work. And all of these sometimes will temporarily work for avoidance, for other styles, in the moment, because there can be a panic of losing the relationship. But over time, it's not going to make them scared to lose you in that regard. They will perceive you oftentimes as the parents who also trapped them or abandoned them. And they'll stay, further in the relationship without threatening back. But one day they will just up and leave the relationship. They will be done with you. And you'll be thinking, I don't understand, what just happened? But because that backfires, they're basically resenting you for making the relationship feel unsafe, because relationships already felt unsafe. And so you just reinforce that narrative, and that's why they will often not respond and then actually just end the relationship. The last two are manipulation and making the person feel jealous. And so we can be manipulative, like I said kind of earlier, by acting like we're busy, ignoring phone calls, saying we have plans when we don't. And the avoidance sees this as that they don't really matter. It's just like they didn't in childhood. And so that manipulation doesn't feel comfortable, and they will also further pull away from you. And then lastly, making them feel jealous. So, the thing about this is that we want them to see us as valuable, but for those who have a more avoidant style, this also triggers their vulnerability, and nobody wants to be cheated on or felt like they're not being chosen, and they want to feel valued just like you do. And so they will eventually respond as feeling like your jealousy is suffocating and they can't handle it, right? It's going to trigger deep emotional responses inside of them. And depending upon how they deal with conflict and intensity and anger, they're not going to know how to respond to that. And so once again, they might do something like that too, to try to that's more of a disengagement behavior to make you jealous. But we're talking about when it's being done to trigger some kind of vulnerability. And at the end of the day, it's often not able to be handled. And so that ends up causing complications and usually the end of the relationship. So those are how I see the vulnerabilities and intimacy-seeking behaviors of often anxious people, how they show up and impact avoidance or even other secure people. I would say some of these things I described as avoidant responses might also be a similar version in a secure person. Now they might deal with it differently, but it might trigger the same things. And so at the heart of this, we're talking about the vulnerability of our different attachment styles and wounds, and how though we're really trying to calm and soothe those, oftentimes it can backfire and injure the relationships. And so a lot of this work, if you're more anxious, is learning how to deal with your own vulnerability without trying to offload it, to get it quickly off of your plate and onto someone else so they can calm and soothe for you. A lot of it is about learning how to calm and soothe yourself. And so you know how to deal with those relationship issues, how to communicate, how to kind of deal with your internal sympathetic nervous system pounding off alarms at you, and you know how to lean in and deal with that, as opposed to panic or try to engage in behaviors that try to just kind of, like I'm saying, get it off of you and get it calmed down without addressing the larger issues of insecurity in the relationship and what's happening. So that is today's video. I hope you found it helpful. I would love to hear your feedback and comments on the concept of vulnerability in general. I think this is the core, which is so scary for us, especially if we didn't receive this general safety in childhood and security. So please stay safe and well, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.